He was a rich mountain man with a lonely heart, until a humble young woman changed his life. Among the towering pines and granite peaks of the Colorado wilderness, where silence speaks louder than words and the wind carries stories of forgotten dreams, a lone mountain man tends to his remote cabin, haunted by memories that echo through the valleys like whispers from another lifetime. Tanner Ridge, his sanctuary carved from the unforgiving wilderness, holds secrets that winter snows have buried but never erased, secrets that will soon awaken with the arrival of spring. There, between trails worn by countless seasons and a garden of wild mountain flowers that once bloomed with hope, an impossible love will bloom, a love that will challenge grief, pride, and the unwritten laws of mountain survival. A love that will prove that even the coldest hearts can thaw under the gentle warmth of understanding. Hello, my dear friend. This is Jasper Ashwood, your narrator of Mountain Tales. Before we start, make sure you subscribe and drop a comment below telling me where you're tuning in from. A big hug to you all, and I hope you enjoy the story. Colorado Territory, year 1878. Winter still gripped the high country with iron determination, leaving intricate frost patterns on cabin windows and a biting wind that cut through even the thickest wool coats like a blade of ice. Through the morning mist that clung to the mountainsides like ghosts of the past, a pack mule train climbed the treacherous mountain path toward Tanner Ridge, carrying in its modest cargo a young woman with pale cheeks and steady eyes, Emma Sullivan. Barely 21 years separated her from childhood, but her expression revealed a maturity born from loss and the harsh lessons that poverty teaches. She clutched in her gloved hands a small leather satchel, worn smooth by her father's touch, the only inheritance from her father, a schoolteacher who had died leaving behind more debts than memories, but whose love for learning lived on in his daughter's heart. The young woman had accepted the position as schoolteacher for the mountain settlement children, with hopes of sending money to her ailing mother back east, and perhaps finding purpose in a life that had grown too cold, too empty, since her father's passing. The pack train halted before the imposing sight of Tanner Ridge. The log cabin of weathered pine and fieldstone chimney seemed to breathe a solemnity that commanded both respect and distance. Wild vines climbed the rough-hewn walls, their dormant branches muting any trace of color, as if nature itself mourned something lost. As she dismounted from the weary mule, Emma felt the thin mountain air fill her lungs and noticed how it smelled of damp earth, pine resin, and an indefinable solitude that seemed to seep from the very stones. Jake Porter, the settlement foreman, and a man whose weathered face spoke of decades spent battling mountain winters, led her toward the main lodge with steps that crunched softly on the frost-covered ground. Inside, the silence was almost tangible, thick as honey and twice as heavy. The wind seemed to whisper through the timber walls, carrying with it the scent of wood smoke and old memories. On the walls hung mounted elk antlers and the weathered tools of mountain life, silent witnesses that observed the newcomer with what seemed like mute judgment. In the main room, beside a stone fireplace where orange flames danced and cast shifting shadows across rough-hewn furniture, waited Mrs. Sarah Tanner, sister-in-law to the Ridge's owner. Around 38 years old, her bearing was practical and unforgiving, her voice firm as mountain granite, and her eyes as cold and unforgiving as the mountain streams that cut through winter ice. She wore a simple wool dress of deep brown, adorned only by a silver brooch that caught the firelight when she moved. "Welcome to Tanner Ridge, Miss Sullivan," she said without warmth, her words falling like small stones into still water. "I trust you understand the gravity and importance of your position here. The children require discipline, guidance, and above all, discretion." Emma inclined her head respectfully, feeling the weight of scrutiny like a physical thing. "I will do everything within my power to earn your confidence and serve this family with honor, Mrs. Tanner." Sarah nodded curtly and allowed her gaze to travel from Emma's simple traveling dress of grey wool to her worn but carefully mended boots, evaluating every detail with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to finding fault. Another teacher, she thought, with barely concealed disdain, another temporary presence in a place that had been ruled too long by grief and the ghosts of better days. Jake then led her through corridors that seemed to absorb sound itself to the eastern cabin, where the children's quarters lay in blessed isolation from the main house. The path was long and meandering, bordered by dormant flower beds that spoke of someone's long-abandoned care. Upon entering young Mary's room, Emma found a girl of about 9 years sitting motionless by the window, gazing toward the valley that stretched below, covered in a thin layer of frost that made the world look fragile as spun glass. Her blonde hair fell loose over thin shoulders, and her small hands rested upon a closed book as if she'd forgotten she was holding it. There was something in her stillness that spoke of deep sadness, of a child who had learned too early that the world could be cold and unforgiving. "Good morning, Miss Mary," Emma greeted gently, her voice carrying the warmth that had always made children feel safe. The girl looked up with eyes that seemed too old for her face. "Are you my new teacher?" she asked in a whisper. "Yes, dear one, I've come to teach you and keep you company whenever you need it." Mary nodded slowly, and for the first time in months the ghost of a smile touched her lips. In the adjoining room, little Tom, barely 6 years old and all elbows and knees, played with carved wooden animals that his father had made in happier times. When he saw her, he ran to hide behind a chair like a startled deer, curious but wary, his dark eyes peering around the furniture with a mixture of hope and caution. Emma crouched to his level, making herself small and unthreatening, and offered him one of her blue ribbons from her traveling bag. "If you keep this safe until tomorrow, I promise to teach you a story about bears that fish in mountain streams and eagles that dance with the wind." The boy took the ribbon with the solemnity of one receiving a sacred trust and laughed, a sound like water over stones that brought the first light to a corner where only silence had reigned for too long. As evening fell across the ridge and painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, Emma decided to explore the settlement's surroundings, drawn by a restlessness she couldn't name. She followed a worn path that meandered through stands of pine and aspen, their bare branches reaching toward the darkening sky like supplicating arms. The path led her to an old trapper's cabin, its logs grey with age and weather, its windows dark as empty eyes. The door hinges groaned like a wounded animal as she opened it, and inside the air was thick with dust motes that danced in the last rays of sunlight, and memories that seemed to cling to every surface. Among empty shelves that had once held supplies and dried herbs that still perfumed the air with ghostly fragrance, she discovered a collection of withered wildflowers, their stems brown and brittle as old bones. Their petals had lost all color, faded to the pale brown of autumn leaves, but they preserved the faint perfume of something that was once beautiful, once cherished. Emma knelt on the dusty floor and touched the earth beneath them with her fingertips, feeling the cold and the life that lay dormant beneath the surface like sleeping promises. "Not everything is dead here," she whispered to herself, her breath visible in the cold air. "Some things just sleep, waiting for the right moment to bloom again." Behind her, a deep voice interrupted the silence like distant thunder. "No one has entered this place for years." Emma turned, startled by the sudden presence, her heart hammering against her ribs. There, framed in the doorway like a figure from a dream, stood Marshal Tanner, tall and broad-shouldered, with a bearing that spoke of strength tempered by sorrow. He wore a buckskin coat that had seen many winters and a wool shirt the color of pine needles. His face, marked by lines of grief and weathered by mountain winds, revealed that sadness had become as much a part of his being as the color of his eyes or the set of his shoulders. "Forgive me, Mr. Tanner," she said respectfully, rising gracefully from her knees and brushing dust from her skirts. "I didn't know this place was forbidden to visitors." He observed her for several long seconds in complete silence, with that penetrating gaze that seemed to measure another's soul and find it either wanting or worthy. "It's not forbidden," he replied finally in a voice low as distant thunder, just forgotten like so many things on this ridge. She lowered her gaze and moved aside a dried stem with fingers that trembled slightly. "Then perhaps it deserves to be remembered, to have someone care for it again." Marshall did not respond to her gentle challenge. He turned without another word and walked away into the gathering dusk, leaving behind only the faint scent of leather worn soft by use and pine smoke that clung to his clothes like the memory of warmth. That night, as Emma sat by the small fire in her modest room, she found herself thinking about the grey eyes of Mr. Tanner. There was in them an abyss of pain deeper than any mountain lake, and something else she couldn't name, something that called to the healer in her heart. She took her notebook, a gift from her father filled with blank pages, waiting for stories, and wrote a brief phrase that seemed to capture the essence of this place. "In this place silence has a face, and the wilderness still breathes with secrets." The days at Tanner Ridge passed with the measured slowness of a place accustomed to grief, where time moved differently, and moments stretched like taffy in the mountain air. Emma devoted herself to her work with the firm gentleness of one who understands that healing takes patience, like one who waters a flower in winter, hoping that someday it will bloom in spring. Each morning, dressed in her simple grey wool dress that had been carefully mended in places and always kept immaculately clean, she crossed the settlement paths with serene steps, learning the rhythm of this isolated world. She had quickly learned not to raise her voice in this place where sound carried like whispers of the dead, to speak with tenderness but unmistakable clarity, to move through the days with the quiet grace that came from understanding that she was a guest in someone else's sorrow. To Mary she offered whispered stories while braiding the girl's fine hair, tales of brave trappers who crossed treacherous mountain passes and discovered valleys where wildflowers bloomed in impossible colors, stories that slowly began to bring light back to eyes that had been dark too long. Tom followed her around the settlement like a loyal puppy, his small feet making soft sounds on the wooden floors as he shadowed her movements, laughing quietly at her gentle teasing, finding in her presence the maternal warmth that had been missing from his young life. Despite her youth and inexperience with such profound grief, Emma had the rare gift of understanding without asking painful questions and moving hearts without needing to touch them, simply by being present and constant as the sunrise. Marshal Tanner observed her from a distance, watching her interactions with his children and the way she moved through his domain. He did so without conscious intention at first, like one who barely notices the presence of a gentle breeze, until it brings the scent of rain and the promise of spring. But with the passing of days and weeks, he began to discover that the settlement had changed in subtle but undeniable ways since that girl with the soft voice and clear eyes had arrived like an unexpected blessing. Mary spoke more freely, her voice losing the fearful whisper that had marked her words since her mother's death. Tom laughed more often, the sound ringing through corridors that had been silent as tombs for far too long. Even the other settlers, the handful of hardy souls who called Tanner Ridge home, seemed less rigid and more hopeful when they saw her pass by with her gentle smile and patient manner. From the window of his study, where he spent long hours trying to lose himself in ledgers and correspondence, Marshall saw her one morning playing with the children in the settlement's central clearing. She ran barefoot through grass still damp with morning dew, her shoes abandoned on a nearby stump, holding a length of rope for Tom to jump, while Mary clapped her hands and counted the successful leaps with delighted laughter. The morning sun, breaking through clouds that had threatened rain, illuminated her light brown hair that she had freed from its usual careful arrangement, and the breeze stirred it like silk banner. Something in that scene, something about the pure joy on his children's faces and the natural grace with which this young woman had brought life back to his world, caused him a tightness in his chest that he couldn't explain and didn't want to examine too closely. Emma's presence awakened dormant echoes in the settlement, not for what she said or did directly, but for what she didn't say, for the respectful way she navigated around the forbidden subjects and painful memories. She never asked about the absent wife whose death had cast such a long shadow over Tanner Ridge, never mentioned the portraits that hung throughout the main house, covered now by black cloth, as if their very sight brought too much pain to bear. But one afternoon, as she passed through the main house on an errand for the children, she stopped for just a moment before one particular frame, barely visible under its shroud of dark lace fabric. Her hand, pale and graceful as a bird, brushed the frame's carved edge for just an instant, before she caught herself and continued on her way, but the gesture was noticed by eyes that watched everything in this house. Sarah Tanner, from her usual position in the main sitting room, where she could observe the comings and goings of everyone in the settlement, perceived with the growing unease of a woman who had built her power on being indispensable that this silent change was more threatening than any direct challenge could have been. She didn't need concrete proof or whispered confessions to know what was happening. Women like Sarah, who had spent years learning to read the subtle signs of shifting affections and changing loyalties, didn't require words to detect when their carefully constructed world was under threat. And Emma Sullivan, with her unbreakable modesty, her irreproachable manners, and her genuine care for the children who had become Sarah's primary means of maintaining her position in the household, was precisely that kind of threat. Not because the girl sought to rise above her station, or because she flirted or schemed, but because her very existence, her simple presence and natural goodness began to occupy a space in the hearts and daily life of Tanner Ridge that Sarah had dominated and controlled since her sister's death. One cloudy afternoon, when the sky hung low and heavy with the promise of rain, Marshall left as he did every week for his solemn journey to the mountain cemetery at Pine Falls, where his wife lay beneath a simple stone marker surrounded by mountain wildflowers that had grown wild and untended. He wore his black coat that he reserved for such occasions, and the wide-brimmed hat that shaded his face from curious eyes, riding away on his sturdy mountain horse with the slow, measured pace of one who carries a burden of grief that grows heavier rather than lighter with time. While he rode away into the grey afternoon, Emma made a decision that would change everything. She decided to return to the old trapper's cabin, carrying in her hands a small canvas bag filled with wildflower seeds she had saved from her journey west, and a small garden trowel that had belonged to her father. Despite the persistent dampness in the air and the way the cold seemed to seep through her wool cloak, she had resolved to revive the wildflowers that had so captured her imagination and her heart from that first day, driven by an intuition that whispered that this forgotten garden deserved another chance at life and beauty. Kneeling on the cold, damp earth that clung to her skirts and stained her apron, her fingers sank deep among the withered roots and dried leaves that spoke of seasons of neglect. Mud worked its way under her fingernails and stained her gloves, and a stubborn lock of hair escaped from her carefully pinned arrangement to fall across her forehead. But she worked with the focused intensity of someone who understands that sometimes the most important work is the kind that no one sees or appreciates. In that moment, with her hands deep in the dark earth and her heart full of hope for these sleeping flowers, she was neither the proper schoolteacher nor the tolerated guest in someone else's home. She was simply a young woman who, in the silence and solitude of this forgotten place, tried to restore life to something that others had given up for lost, to prove that with patience and care, even the most barren ground could bloom again. Marshall returned from his pilgrimage earlier than usual, driven home by storm clouds that gathered with threatening speed and a wind that carried the scent of rain and change. Upon entering the settlement clearing, he stopped his horse abruptly when he saw her kneeling in the garden of the old cabin, her figure small and determined against the backdrop of the approaching storm. Emma didn't notice his presence, so absorbed was she in her work, cleaning the stems with an old cloth she had found, whispering encouragement to the dormant plants as if her words alone could coax them back to life. The setting sun, struggling to break through the gathering clouds, cast the entire scene in tones of gold and amber that made her hair shine and her skin glow as if lit from within. He remained there for several long minutes without announcing himself, his horse stamping impatiently, while he watched this young woman work with such tender care on something that everyone else considered dead and worthless. His gaze rested on her face, serene with concentration, on the graceful curve of her neck as she bent to her task, on the way her lips moved in what looked like a whispered conversation with the flowers themselves. Something shifted inside his chest as he watched her, something that had been locked away for so long he had forgotten it existed. It wasn't Emma's youth that disturbed him, nor her beauty, though she was lovely in the unconscious way of those who have never thought much about their appearance. It was the life that seemed to radiate from her without effort, the hope that she carried like a candle in a dark room, the faith that dead things could live again if someone cared enough to tend them. When he finally dismounted and approached, the soft sound of his boots on the path caused her to stand immediately, shaking her skirts hurriedly and trying to restore some semblance of propriety to her disheveled appearance. "Forgive me, Mr. Tanner," she said, her voice slightly breathless from her exertion and embarrassment at being caught in such an undignified state. "I didn't intend to presume or overstep my bounds." "Who gave you permission to work here?" he asked, his tone carefully neutral but without the harshness that might have been expected. She met his eyes with the steady honesty that he was learning was simply part of her nature. "No one, sir. I didn't think permission was needed for such a small thing. I just thought it would be good to try, to see if they might live again." Marshall lowered his gaze from her flushed face to the disturbed ground at his feet, then to the flower bed where new green shoots were already beginning to show among the brown stems she had carefully cleaned and arranged. He breathed deeply, as if trying to remember a perfume that had once filled these mountains and made life seem full of possibilities. "My wife loved these flowers," he said finally, his voice thick with memory and regret. "She spent hours here tending them, talking to them. They died at the same time she did." Emma didn't respond immediately, understanding instinctively that some silences are sacred and shouldn't be broken with easy words or false comfort. She simply nodded slowly and remained still, her hands clasped before her, earth-stained and honest. "Those flowers," he added after a pause that stretched like an held breath, "perhaps they do deserve another chance to bloom." And without saying more, without meeting her eyes again, he turned and walked away through the gathering dusk, leaving her alone with the flowers and the promise of rain, and something that felt too much like hope to be entirely safe. That night, while in the main dining hall the usual silence reigned, and the only sounds were the soft clink of utensils moving precisely over wooden plates and pewter cups, Sarah looked at her brother-in-law sideways, her pale eyes calculating and cold. "I noticed you passed by the old garden this afternoon," she said, her voice carrying the deceptive sweetness of honey poured over broken glass. "How did you find it?" "The wildflowers are beginning to sprout again," Marshall replied simply, not looking up from his untouched meal. "How curious," Sarah replied, her smile as sharp as winter wind as she fixed her penetrating gaze on Emma, who sat at the far end of the table as befitted her position. "Some sprouts have a way of blooming without anyone having called them forth. Sometimes they grow in places where they don't belong." Emma raised her eyes for just a second and met Sarah's stare directly, seeing clearly the warning that lay beneath the seemingly innocent words. It wasn't anger she saw in the older woman's expression, but something far more dangerous, the cold calculation of someone who had identified a threat and was prepared to deal with it accordingly. She understood, with the clarity that comes from growing up in circumstances where survival depended on reading such signals correctly, that she had just crossed an invisible threshold from which there would be no return, no going back to the simple life of an overlooked servant in someone else's house. Spring settled over Colorado territory like a blessing long withheld, bringing with it the kind of days that make even the hardest heart remember what it means to hope. At Tanner Ridge, the air became permeated with the perfume of wildflowers that Emma had managed to coax back to life through patience and faith, their purple and white blossoms creating patches of color against the weathered wood of the settlement buildings, like promises kept after a long winter of doubt. The transformation was remarkable to anyone who had eyes to see it. Where once there had been only brown earth and broken stems, now there were living things reaching toward the sun, their faces turned upward with the eternal optimism that belongs only to growing things. But the changes went deeper than mere flowers, touching the very soul of the settlement in ways both subtle and profound. One morning in late spring, while the children sat by the main fireplace practicing their letters, with the careful concentration of those for whom learning is still a wonder, Emma received a letter, delivered by the monthly mail rider, who made the treacherous journey up the mountain paths. It came from a small coastal town far to the north, where lived Beth Morrison, a friend from her childhood days when the world had seemed simpler, and loss was something that happened to other people in stories, rather than the constant companion it had become. The letter was brief, written with blue ink on paper that somehow still carried the faint scent of salt air and lavender from Beth's garden, a world away from these mountain peaks. Beth wrote with the cheerful determination of someone trying to bridge an impossible distance, telling Emma about her own work at a small school for miners' children, about the flowers she had planted in memory of friends they had both lost, about the way the ocean looked in winter when storms turned the waves to moving mountains. But beneath the cheerful news, Emma could read the real message, the concern for a friend who had vanished into the wilderness and whose letters had grown increasingly infrequent. Beth wondered, with the delicacy of someone who understands that some wounds are too tender to probe directly, whether Emma was truly happy in that remote settlement where letters took so long to reach their destination, and where the silence between words seemed to echo with meanings that couldn't be spoken aloud. Emma smiled with a tenderness that held equal measures of gratitude and sorrow as she read these words that connected her to a life that seemed as distant as a dream. She lit a candle against the gathering dusk, prepared her pen with the careful ritual of someone for whom writing is both gift and burden, and sat before the small wooden desk in her modest room that had become her sanctuary in this place of careful silences. The evening breeze that came down from the high peaks moved the simple curtains she had sewn from fabric scraps, and far below her window the clearing spread like a sea of wildflowers in constant motion, purple and white waves that seemed to dance in rhythm with her heartbeat. She began writing naturally, sharing news of the children and their progress, The weather that changed from moment to moment in these high places, the small victories and quiet joys that made up her daily life at Tanner Ridge. But as the lines progressed and the candle burned lower, casting shifting shadows across the paper, her pen began to hesitate, the words coming slower and deeper, as if some part of her soul was trying to speak truths that her mind wasn't yet ready to acknowledge. The letters grew less careful, more honest, as if the distance between herself and Beth had created a safe space where feelings could be examined without fear of immediate consequence. "There is in this settlement a different kind of silence," she wrote, her hand moving almost without conscious direction, "one that doesn't wound the way loneliness does, but instead seems to accompany a person like a faithful companion. It's the silence of mountains that have watched over human joys and sorrows for countless generations, holding our secrets without judgment. Mr. Tanner is a man difficult to describe with simple words, so correct in all his dealings, so distant in his manner, maintaining always the proper distance between employer and employee. And yet when he stops to speak about small things, about the weather or the children's progress, or the way the wildflowers are returning to life in his wife's garden, it seems as if something within him is asking for help that he cannot bring himself to request directly. I find myself watching for him in the mornings when I cross to the children's quarters, listening for the sound of his voice in the corridors, noticing the way the light falls across his shoulders when he stands in the clearing at sunset, looking toward the mountains as if he's searching for something he lost among those peaks. I don't know if what I feel when he looks at me is respect for his position, gratitude for his kindness to a stranger, or something I don't dare name even to myself in the privacy of my own thoughts." She stopped writing abruptly, her breath catching as she realized how much of her heart she had spilled across the page, like wine across a white tablecloth. The ink had dripped in one spot, forming a small dark stain that looked like a tear frozen in time. She closed her eyes and brought her hand to her chest, feeling her heart race with the rhythm of someone who has just confessed a secret that changes everything. "Perhaps it's only compassion," she added finally, the words coming slowly, as if each one had to be dragged from some deep place inside her soul, the natural response of one wounded heart recognizing the pain in another. "Perhaps what I mistake for something deeper is nothing more than the human need to comfort suffering wherever we find it." She folded the letter with hands that trembled slightly, creasing it with the careful precision of someone who has learned that important things must be protected from careless handling. But instead of sealing it immediately and sending it away where it could do no harm, she found herself hesitating, reluctant to make final something that felt too honest, too revealing, too dangerous to exist in the world where other eyes might see it and make judgments. Instead, she kept it between the pages of the leather notebook, where she recorded the children's daily lessons and her own observations about life in this remote place, intending to seal it properly in the morning when she could read it again with clearer eyes and perhaps soften some of the more revealing passages. She left the notebook on the small table beside her bed, not imagining that this moment of hesitation, this small delay, would seal her fate as surely as any deliberate choice. That same night, while the settlement lay wrapped in the profound darkness that comes only to places far from the lights of civilization, a shadow moved through the corridors with the practiced silence of someone who has learned to move unseen through spaces where every sound carries meaning. The figure stopped before Emma's door, listening for the deep, even breathing that indicates peaceful sleep, then pushed the door just far enough to slip inside like smoke given form. The room was small and simply furnished, containing only the necessities that befitted someone in Emma's position, but it was kept with the kind of careful attention that spoke of someone who finds dignity in making the most of humble circumstances. On the small table beside the bed, the leather notebook lay open to the page where the letter rested, its words clearly visible in the pale moonlight that streamed through the single window. A hand encased in delicate gloves moved with practiced efficiency, lifting the letter from its resting place and unfolding it with the careful movements of someone accustomed to handling evidence that could destroy lives. The pale eyes that read those words by candlelight carried no compassion, only the cold satisfaction of a hunter who has found exactly the weakness she was searching for. Sarah Tanner read every word, with the thorough attention of someone who understands that knowledge is power, and that the right information, used at the right moment, can change the course of human destiny. When she finished, she folded the letter again with the same care Emma had used, replaced it exactly where she had found it, and slipped away into the darkness with a smile that would have chilled the mountain air if anyone had been awake to see it. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with that crystalline quality that mountain air takes on when winter is finally releasing its grip and allowing spring to transform the world. Emma woke with a strange feeling of unease, as if some part of her sleeping mind had registered the intrusion into her private space, but she could find no concrete reason for the anxiety that seemed to cling to her thoughts, like morning mist. It was on this bright morning that Marshall asked Jake Porter to summon Miss Sullivan to his study, a request that was unusual enough to cause raised eyebrows among the settlement's residents, but not so strange as to provoke open comment. Emma arrived wearing her best day dress of deep blue wool, her hair arranged with particular care, and her hands showing the faint ink stains that marked her as someone who spends her days with books and learning. The study where Marshall conducted the business of the settlement was a room that spoke of serious purpose and careful thought, lined with books that had been collected over years of mountain winters, when reading was often the only entertainment available. The air held the mingled scents of leather bindings, wood smoke from the fireplace, and the tobacco that Marshall occasionally smoked during long evenings of solitary reflection. "I hope you will forgive the informality of this meeting, Miss Sullivan," he began, his manner carefully correct but somehow less distant than usual. "I've been reviewing some documents that belong to my late wife, letters and papers that I haven't had the heart to examine properly until now, and I found something that I thought might interest you." He moved to a wooden chest that sat beneath one of the tall windows, its surface polished smooth by years of use and careful tending. From inside, he withdrew a bundle of papers tied with a faded ribbon, letters written in a feminine hand on paper that had yellowed with age, but still carried the ghost of perfume that had once been his wife's signature scent. "My wife, Margaret, was an educated woman, much like yourself, and she found the isolation of mountain life challenging at times. She wrote extensively, partly to maintain correspondence with friends and family in Denver, but also, I believe, as a way of keeping her thoughts and feelings clear in her own mind. This particular letter speaks of the wildflower garden that you've taken such care to restore." Emma raised her gaze from the bundle of letters in his hands to meet his eyes directly, and she saw there something she had never noticed before, a vulnerability that he usually kept hidden beneath his careful courtesy. "Perhaps writing was her way of keeping her thoughts and memories alive," she said softly, "of holding on to the things that mattered most when the world seemed too large and lonely to bear alone." "Yes," he said, nodding slowly, as if she had put into words something he had long felt, but never been able to express. "But sometimes I think that writing, no matter how eloquent or heartfelt, isn't enough to keep alive the things we love most. Sometimes I think we need living hands and caring hearts to tend the gardens that words alone cannot maintain." The silence that followed was dense with unspoken meanings, charged with the kind of electricity that comes before mountain storms. Emma dared to lift her gaze completely and study his face with the direct attention she had never before allowed herself. She saw him differently now, not as the distant and somewhat forbidding master of Tanner Ridge, but as a man whose shoulders had been bent by burdens too heavy for one person to carry alone, whose voice carried less certainty than it once had, whose face showed the kind of exhaustion that comes from fighting battles that cannot be won through strength alone. "I don't know if I have ever told you about Margaret, about the kind of woman she was," he continued, his voice taking on a tone of reflection that suggested he was speaking as much to himself as to her. "Everyone who knew her remembers her as a perfect lady, beautiful and accomplished, always saying the right thing and making the proper impression. But she wasn't perfect, Miss Sullivan, any more than the rest of us are perfect. She was impulsive when the mood took her, impatient with the slow pace of mountain life, and sometimes when the winter months stretched too long and the isolation became unbearable, she could be cruel in the way that hurt people sometimes are, lashing out at those nearest to them because they have no other target for their pain. But when she laughed, truly laughed with the joy that comes from deep contentment, everything in this settlement became different, warmer, more alive." His words fell slowly, each one carefully chosen, like drops of rain falling into a still pool. Emma listened with her heart racing and her breath shallow, understanding somehow that he was sharing something precious and fragile, something that he had never spoken aloud to another living soul. The trust implicit in his confession moved her more than any declaration of affection could have done. I don't know at what moment her light began to consume itself from within, he continued, his gaze fixed on some point beyond the window where the mountains rose like sleeping giants against the afternoon sky. Perhaps it was when she realized that the children she wanted so desperately would never come to fill these rooms with their laughter. Perhaps it was when she began to believe, despite all my clumsy attempts to reassure her, that my love wasn't enough to make up for all the things she had given up to follow me into this wilderness. You must have loved her very much, Emma whispered, the words barely audible above the sound of her own heartbeat. Her throat felt tight with emotions she couldn't name, grief for a woman she had never met, compassion for the man who still carried the weight of her loss, and something else that she didn't dare examine too closely. Marshall turned to look at her directly then, his grey eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her feel as if he could see through all her careful defenses to the truth she kept hidden even from herself. I loved her, yes, with all the devotion a young man can muster when he believes love can conquer any obstacle. But I also feared her, Miss Sullivan, feared the depths of her sadness and the power it had to change everything I thought I understood about life and happiness. When she died, after a fever that took her so quickly I barely had time to understand what was happening, I believed that the silence that followed was a just punishment for my cowardice. For all the times I turned away from her pain instead of facing it directly and trying to help her bear it, I thought that loneliness was what I deserved for failing her when she needed me most, until you arrived at Tanner Ridge and showed me that silence doesn't have to be empty, that solitude doesn't have to mean despair. Emma felt a shiver run through her entire body, starting from some deep place in her chest and radiating outward until even her fingertips tingled with the shock of recognition. She immediately lowered her gaze, trying to regain control of emotions that suddenly felt too large and too dangerous for the small space of this mountain study. I didn't come here intending to change anything, Mr. Tanner, she said, her voice soft but steady. I only wanted to fulfill my duties as a teacher and perhaps find some small purpose in caring for your children and helping them learn. But you have done more than that, he interrupted gently, moving a step closer to where she stood beside the window, the afternoon light falling across her shoulders like a blessing. You have given them something I didn't even know they were missing. You've shown them that learning can be joyful, that growing up doesn't have to mean becoming hard and distant, that there is still beauty in the world for those who know how to look for it. More than that, you have given this entire settlement something I had thought was lost forever. Hope. Hope that dead things can live again if someone cares enough to tend them with patience and faith. Hope that silence can be companionable rather than oppressive. Hope that the future might hold something better than endless repetition of past sorrows. The words hung in the air between them, like a bridge that might lead somewhere wonderful or somewhere dangerous. She couldn't tell which. Emma found herself caught between the desire to step forward onto that bridge and the wisdom that told her some crossings, once made, could never be undone. The proper response would be to thank him for his kind words, excuse herself politely, and return to her duties with the children, maintaining the careful distance that protected them both from complications neither was prepared to handle. But instead, she found herself looking up into his face and speaking from a place of honesty that surprised them both. You haven't altered anything fundamental about this settlement, Mr. Tanner. What you've done is simply allowed the air to move freely again, cleared away the barriers that were keeping life from flowing naturally through these halls and rooms. For a long moment that seemed to stretch like eternity. Neither of them spoke. The fire in the grate crackled softly, sending dancing shadows across the book-lined walls, and somewhere in the distance they could hear the faint sounds of children playing, their voices carrying on the mountain air like music. In that charged silence, both of them could hear the contained beating of something that neither quite dared to name, something that pulsed between them like a living thing waiting to be acknowledged and given permission to grow. Finally, Marshall stepped back, the movement small but decisive, like someone who has approached the edge of a cliff and decided that the view, however beautiful, is too dangerous to contemplate for long. Thank you for your time and attention, Miss Sullivan, he said formally, his voice carefully neutral again. That will be all for now. Emma curtsied with the automatic grace of someone who has been well taught in the forms of respectful behavior, but her eyes remained on his face for a moment longer than strictly proper, as if she were trying to memorize something she might never see again. Thank you for sharing your memories with me, Mr. Tanner. It means more than I can say to understand something of the woman who loved this place before me. As she left the study, and made her way back through corridors that seemed somehow different now, charged with new possibilities and new dangers. Emma felt her heart beating with a rhythm that seemed too quick and too loud for the quiet halls of Tanner Ridge. She was so absorbed in her own thoughts and feelings that she didn't notice the figure that stood in the shadows at the far end of the main corridor, watching her progress with eyes that missed nothing and a smile that held no warmth. That night, as Emma lay in her narrow bed listening to the wind that came down from the high peaks and set the mountain pines to singing their eternal song of longing and endurance, she noticed with a growing sense of unease that something in her room felt different, disturbed in some way she couldn't quite identify. The feeling was so vague that she almost dismissed it as a product of her unsettled emotions, but as she rose to light a candle and check her few possessions, a chill ran through her that had nothing to do with the mountain air. The notebook where she kept her teaching records and personal observations was exactly where she had left it, but somehow it didn't look quite right, as if someone had moved it slightly and then attempted to replace it in its original position without quite succeeding. Her hands trembling slightly with a fear she couldn't name, she opened it to the page where she had left the letter to Beth, the letter that contained feelings and observations she had never intended for any eyes but her own. The letter was there, apparently undisturbed, but something about the way it was folded didn't look quite right to eyes that had learned to notice small details and remember them exactly. A terrible suspicion began to form in her mind, growing stronger with each moment of examination, until she was forced to acknowledge what she had been trying to deny. Someone had been in her room, had read her private thoughts, had learned secrets that could destroy not only her position at Tanner Ridge, but potentially her entire future. As she sat there in the flickering candlelight, holding the evidence of her own careless honesty, Emma felt a cold certainty settle over her like a shroud. She had crossed not only the invisible threshold that Sarah had warned her about, but had also provided her enemy with exactly the weapon needed to ensure her destruction. The game, whatever it was, had just become deadly serious, and she was no longer sure she understood the rules well enough to survive what was coming. May brought bright days. Sarah had planned an evening in honor of Colonel Harrison's visit, a business partner of Marshall's. The widowed military man traveled to Colorado with intention of formalizing a convenient union. Emma was assigned to auxiliary service during the evening. She wore a modest, dark gray dress with black apron. The guests began arriving before twilight. Emma moved through the hall delivering cups with lowered gaze. During dinner, Colonel Harrison made direct allusion to the convenience of joining with a sensible, stable lady. Sarah laughed gracefully. "You've come to the right place, Colonel. Tanner Ridge is full of such women." After dinner in the music room, Sarah approached the piano with absolute confidence. She asked for silence and drew from her bag a folded sheet. "I'd like to share something I found among the library papers," she said sweetly. Marshall frowned. Emma turned toward Sarah with ice climbing her spine. "There is in this settlement a different silence," read Sarah. "Mr. Tanner is a man difficult to describe, so correct, so distant. And yet when he stops to speak, it seems something within him asks for help. I don't know if it's respect, gratitude, or something I don't dare name what I feel when he looks at me." A murmur ran through the room. Emma felt blood drain from her face. The letter. That letter she never sent. "I don't know who wrote this," continued Sarah with false innocence, "but the content proves somewhat inappropriate, considering the circumstances." Marshall broke the silence with firm voice. "That's enough, Sarah. The letter was stolen, and reading it publicly has been baseness." Emma, unable to utter a word, turned and left the hall, feeling each step hurt more than the last. Mary ran after her, crying, "Miss Sullivan, don't leave!" But Emma didn't stop. She climbed the path without looking back, heart in pieces. Morning came wrapped in thick fog. Emma awakened without having slept. The public humiliation had been brutal. She wrote a brief resignation note, thanked for the opportunity, and apologized for any inconvenience caused. She left the settlement by the back trail, as if her presence was already a shame that should disappear. In the days that followed, the atmosphere at Tanner Ridge didn't become lighter as Sarah had expected. The settlement seemed to have withered. Mary stopped eating regularly. Tom became irritable. Emma's absence was felt in every corner. Marshall began to sicken with a fatigue that invaded him slowly. One afternoon, he found a draft of the letter Emma had written. The words pierced him like a silent dagger. the respect and confusion of someone who had sought nothing more than to find meaning amid solitude. He held it against his chest. Then he went out to the clearing. He walked to the wooden gazebo and sat just as it began to rain. He didn't flee the water. Rain fell like mute redemption. There Marshall finally understood that what he felt wasn't compassion but something deeper, truer. The village of Pine Creek lay several miles north. There, Emma had arrived with a small trunk and the determination to rebuild what remained of her soul. She taught with gentleness at the Pine Creek School, a refuge for orphaned children. She dressed simply, with hair gathered in a low bun. She didn't speak of the past. In free afternoons she sat under an oak, reading quietly or contemplating the sky, but wildflowers didn't stop appearing in her memories. One morning in late May, the school director approached her. "Miss Sullivan, you have a visitor." Emma rose and walked to the entrance. She saw a dark wagon. Then at the foot of the steps stood Mary. The girl ran toward her, tears shining in her eyes. The embrace seemed to stop time. "Miss Sullivan," said Mary, sobbing, "you shouldn't have left. Everything is so sad without you." Behind her stood Mr. Porter. "Miss Sullivan," he greeted, "Mr. Tanner has sent me with Miss Mary and this." He handed her a small bouquet of wildflowers wrapped in brown paper. Between the stems was a folded note. Emma sat under the oak with Mary at her side and opened it. "Emma, I've taken too long to write you. I have no excuses that can erase what I allowed to happen. My silence was cowardice, and my distance was betrayal. But now I understand there are errors that can only be remedied with firm decisions, not with words. If in some corner of your soul remains a seed of what we were capable of building, I beg you give me the opportunity to care for it, as you cared for wildflowers when I had already given them up for lost. Marshall." Emma folded the letter with trembling hands. Her eyes burned, but she didn't cry. She only caressed the paper as if it were part of beloved skin. The wagon advanced along the gravel path leading to Tanner Ridge. The June sky framed the scene with soft light. Emma observed through the window with agitated heart. She wore a light blue muslin dress, simple with soft lines. Upon arriving, Emma stepped down with firm steps. Before her, Marshall Tanner waited. He wore a pearl grey suit. His eyes, though marked by sleeplessness, shone with different light. "Miss Sullivan," he said with low voice, charged with emotion. "Welcome." There were no protocols, only that moment suspended in air where past and present looked at each other without need for explanations. They walked in silence toward the clearing. The path led them to the wooden gazebo, wrapped in branches of wildflowers in bloom, like an altar consecrated to everything they could still do. "I've made many mistakes, Emma," Marshall began. "I was wrong not to defend you, to let fear speak louder than my heart. I thought I could live without you, but when I saw you leave, when I saw how the settlement remained without air, I knew I was no longer a complete man." Emma lowered her gaze. "I wasn't sent here to change anything," she whispered. "I only wanted to fulfill my duty." "And you fulfilled more than that," he interrupted. "You gave this settlement the hope it had lost." The silence that followed was thick, charged with everything they hadn't dared say. "Why do you call me now?" asked Emma finally. Marshall held her gaze. "Because I no longer want to live in the shadow of what's expected of me. Because if there's still a possibility that you forgive me, I won't let it escape." "It's not forgiveness I seek, Mr. Tanner." "Then what do you seek?" She breathed deeply. "A life where I don't have to hide what I feel or fear what others might think." Marshall leaned slightly toward her. "If you permit me, I'd like to offer you that life, not as reward or redemption, but as promise." Emma closed her eyes for an instant. When she opened them, something in her face had softened. It wasn't an answer, but neither was it denial, and that was enough for Marshall. That night, Sarah Tanner entered her brother-in-law's office. "So she's returned?" she asked with icy tone. Marshall raised his gaze calmly. "Yes. And you think to present her as respectable lady, after what was said of her?" "After what you allowed to be said of her," he corrected firmly. Sarah narrowed her eyes. "You've put your reputation at stake." "No, all for an upright woman who taught me the value of silence and truth." Sarah understood. For the first time in years, her influence had no effect on him. She left the office without saying more. Summer settled over Colorado territory. The powerful and widowed mountain man, Marshall Tanner, had been seen in company of a young teacher, not as employee, but as equal. The rumors began to acquire more visible forms. It was then he made a decision that would shake Colorado's high society. He would attend the annual charitable event of the Carson Foundation, accompanied by Emma.
Before we begin, let's connect. Tell us in the comments, where are you watching from, my amazing people?
The day of the event arrived with a stillness so deep the entire territory seemed to hold its breath. When Marshall stepped down from the wagon, he wore a black dress coat adorned with a single wildflower in his lapel, a quiet symbol of everything he had once lost and everything he was willing to claim again. He extended a steady hand toward Emma as she descended. She wore a lavender silk gown, her hair woven with fresh wildflowers that glowed in the soft spring light. Whispers rippled instantly through the crowd, but Emma, her arm linked with Marshall's, continued forward with a calm, unwavering step. It wasn't pride that carried her. It was a fragile but unbreakable dignity, the trembling strength of someone who had suffered and survived. Later that evening, as the orchestra fell silent and the hall dimmed in anticipation, the master of ceremonies announced that Mary Tanner wished to speak. The little girl walked to the podium with the quiet resolve of someone far older than her years. "Good evening," she began. "I'm not orphaned or poor, but a year ago I lived in a place where no one smiled. My mother had died. My guardian became a shadow. My little brother cried without sound, and I cried too, until someone arrived, someone who brought us no gifts, made no promises, only patience, stories before sleep, and wildflowers in spring." Mary turned her small face toward Emma. "That person is here tonight. Her name is Emma Sullivan. She is not wealthy, nor from a famous family, but she gave us back our light." The hall fell into a breathless silence. Then from somewhere at the back, a woman began to clap. Another joined her, then another. Within moments, the entire hall erupted into an ovation that shattered every unspoken prejudice lingering in the room. Emma covered her mouth, overwhelmed as tears filled her eyes. Marshall took her hand, not with romance, but with solemn promise, a vow made before all who doubted her. When they returned to Tanner Ridge that night, Sarah was waiting. The arrogance in her eyes was gone, replaced by the cold realization of defeat. "It seems the young lady has won," she murmured. "It isn't a victory, Sarah," Marshall replied quietly. "It's simply the end of a war that should never have been fought." The next morning, Sarah left the settlement without a sound. Dawn arrived wrapped in soft mist. Spring had finally claimed the Colorado mountains, and Tanner Ridge stood in its fullest bloom. In the clearing, beneath a white gazebo dressed in wildflowers, an intimate ceremony awaited. Emma descended the steps of the eastern cabin wearing a simple white muslin dress tied with a lavender ribbon at her waist. Wildflowers, arranged lovingly by Mary, crowned her hair. Marshall waited under the gazebo in a light gray coat, his expression serene, free for the first time in years from the long shadows of grief. The ceremony was brief. A family friend offered a simple blessing. When Emma and Marshall joined hands, they shared a gaze so deep and steady that no spoken words could rival its meaning. Mary stepped forward and read softly from Emma's diary. "Today, I watered wildflowers with tears, but also with hope. I don't know if they'll ever bloom, but if they do, maybe they'll return the life this settlement lost." When the ceremony ended, the couple walked hand in hand beneath arches of flowers. There was no music, no rice, only the song of the mountains and the whisper of the breeze blessing their union. Days later, a small school opened its doors in Denver, the Sullivan Tanner School, named in honor of Edward Sullivan, teacher of free hearts. Emma taught reading and writing to orphaned children, while Marshall spent his afternoons assisting in the library. The children called him the Wildflower Man. Mary and Tom blossomed like wildflowers themselves. Their sorrow faded into gratitude, and Tanner Ridge filled with laughter, open books, and light footsteps echoing along the mountain paths. One autumn afternoon, Emma paused in the clearing. breathing deeply the crisp air. Marshall approached, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "Do you remember when you told me wildflowers could bloom again?" She smiled gently. "They never stopped trying. They just needed faith and a second spring." 9 years passed since the day Emma and Marshall joined hands. 9 springs, 9 winters, 9 seasons of love that endured without losing its soft glow. They had 2 children, Lily, 6 years old, with Emma's courageous spirit and Marshall's contemplative eyes, and Edward, 3, with golden curls and a mischievous smile. Mary and Tom studied medicine at a university that once barred women from entering. Tom became a poet, his verses inspired by the family that saved him. They carried the Tanner name with pride, not for its legacy of sorrow, but for the love that rebuilt it. The Sullivan Tanner School grew from a humble classroom into an entire block. Each year, Emma read the same lines to her students. "No child should grow believing knowledge is a privilege. Learning is their right, and so is dreaming." The world changed slowly. What had once been scandal became example. Sarah paid the final price of her pride. She died alone in a poor boarding house, clutching only a faded newspaper clipping announcing Emma and Marshall's wedding. Every anniversary, Emma and Marshall planted a new wildflower in the Tanner Ridge clearing. That year, little Lily knelt beside them with hands covered in earth, her laughter ringing like music in the crisp air. Emma watched her daughter, thinking of her own father, of winters of scarcity, of all the fears and rejections she had once carried. Then she looked at Marshall, still with the same gaze he had given her 9 years earlier, and she understood. Time hadn't worn their love. It had polished it, because sometimes the most beautiful flowers bloom in the most unexpected places. Emma and Marshall's story reminds us that true love ignores social class, silence, and scandal. It needs only courage, time, and 2 hearts willing to heal side by side. What began as a quiet glance in a grieving settlement became a legacy that changed generations. If this story touched your heart, tell me which moment moved you the most: the children's tenderness, the reborn clearing, or Emma's courage to choose love without fear. And if you made it to the end, write flowers in the comments. It's how I know you're someone who feels stories with their soul, and it helps this channel continue to grow. Thank you for joining me once more on this journey through time's corridors where love always finds a way.